Everyone, welcome back to another episode of Journey to Purpose. Today I have with me the wonderful Dave Thorne. He is an emotional wealth coach. Dave, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Pippa. Thanks for having me.
So first, very easy question is, where in the world are you?
Well, I'm in Farn. I'm in Surrey. So I'm right on the Surrey-Hampshire border, right on the South Downs. It's beautiful, beautiful
Very
out
nice
here.
part of the world. Anything
It
with
is.
Surrey in it makes me go, yep, that's nice part of the world.
Mostly.
So what is an emotional wealth coach?
So emotional wealth coach is very much about finding your emotional self-worth. So it's my mission in life to inspire and empower people to find the confidence and self-worth to serve themselves and the world with authenticity and purpose. Self-confidence and self-worth have gone downhill massively over the last 10, 15 years, particularly. But ever since sort of social media really started taking off, you could sort of see it when I was at university back in 2004. You could start to see it kind of happening as things like the Facebook, as it was back then, MySpace, etc., started taking off, and you had people commenting and what we now know as trolling, but taking the mick banter, etc., coming in. You could just see things would start to go downhill from that because suddenly people couldn't get the break from the bullies at school, and it has happened, particularly in the chronically ill world, the disabled world, the neurodiverse world. A lot of worlds where isms and obias are problematic. In terms of that they are considered within a minority, and obviously the obias being the fear of, in speech marks, of something that is not necessarily something to be feared of, almost always never. But also the sort of the isms in similar manner. It's, pretending someone or something is not worth it based solely on a characteristic or a trait, 99.9% of which nobody has any control over.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to help people, again, particularly the chronically ill and the disabled, to just find their self-worth, to stand up for themselves and say, this is me, this is who I am, this is my reason for being here. It stems back from having cystic fibrosis and going through life never knowing how long I'm going to have good quality health for. And the definition of good quality health and good quality of life for someone with cystic fibrosis is different to someone without cystic fibrosis and without maybe any other chronic illnesses. We've gone through life as someone with CF knowing that things like transplant, lung transplant in particular, is a huge probability. What does that do for your self-worth to know that actually at some point the only way you may stay alive is by having someone else's body parts in you? What does that do to you to grow up in hospital, learn your social skills off nurses, doctors, so adults, not people your own age? And then when you get a bit of health, you go to school, don't really know anybody because you've grown up away from all these people. You've grown up with doctors and you're used to sharing your deepest, most intimate things, not quite casually, but near enough casually. And suddenly you're doing that with kids. They don't get it. They don't understand. So they take the mickey at the strange kid. And then the kid disappears for 6 weeks because they're ill again. And the whole thing cycles. What does that do to you? To spend or not have the health to work, and all you hear on the news is talk of scroungers because you're on benefits, or you watch Jeremy Kyle or other daytime TV and the same thing happens. You're just told you're a scrounger. What does that do to your self-worth? To the point that the depression kicks in and you can understand the cycle and the negative cycles that people end up in, and they just feel worthless. And suddenly getting out of bed is a challenge.
Yeah. So you've obviously had a very personal experience of this being with cystic fibrosis. For those who don't, can you explain what cystic fibrosis is and how it affects you for those who may not be aware?
Yes, of course. So cystic fibrosis is a genetic condition which basically all the fluids in my body are too thick, but especially the lining of the lungs. So there's a mucous membrane that we all have around our lungs, and it basically protects the organ a little bit, but it's a perfect breeding ground for bugs because the lungs are warm. They're full of food because there's a lot of blood going there and there's lots of air. So it's a perfect breeding ground for bugs. And in most people, that's not a problem because this stuff's about the thickness of water. So nothing can hang around. It gets moved around and moved out fairly quickly. In people with things like CF, it can be as thick as cement. But, in most people's cases, it's somewhere between runny honey and cement. And so the bugs get trapped. And so they grow and multiply. And a lot of these bugs are really damaging to humans. It's just they don't live in, say, your lungs long enough to get to be a problem. These bugs might need 6, 12, 18 weeks to be able to get to a point that it would cause you a problem. Well, in my lungs or someone with CF's lungs, that's easier than in, say, your lungs.
I mean,
So we often end up very prone to chest infections. We'll often sort of show classic asthma symptoms. Most of us do actually also have asthma because of how it's defined, narrowed airways. And we also don't digest our food properly. So we have to take enzyme pills for that. And on top of that, because we're not getting all the nutrients from our food, we're technically now undernourished, or we have to eat more to stay nourished. And, we don't put on weight properly. You need the weight to maintain your health. And it just basically all becomes a vicious cycle.
It sounds, just listening to that, I can totally hear how that's exhausting already. And then you add on what you've talked about already, that social layer of how you connect with people growing up. And obviously connection is so important for humans, and how you find acceptance. So I'm guessing from what you said, you had some pretty challenging times as a child and maybe even as an adult so far.
Yeah, I mean, consider myself very lucky to have been born when I was. So I was born in the early to mid 80s. And when I was born, although life expectancy was 2 to 9, and with me, we've always tended to use 2 purely because I nearly died so many times between birth and 2. It was very much a case of everything started to improve and develop around that time. So unlike many people who were born even sort of 3-4 years before me, I was able to hit those thrive markers at 5, which meant I stood a much, much better chance of survival. So one of the reasons life expectancy was so low was because we couldn't digest our food. The digestive enzymes that we take were not particularly good quality. A really good quality one came to the UK in 84, very early 84, and June 83. So I was about 6 months old. So for the best part of my life, I've had access to a really good quality enzyme. And it's interesting that post sort of 1980-ish children started to improve a lot because they hit the thrive markers at 5. Those that weren't before then didn't. In 89, they discovered the gene that causes CF. Now, it was discovered in what became part of the Human Genome Project, but it was hoped that, genetic modification, etc., and all these things that are still not really here now, and they are on the edge of science, would be a lot quicker, and we'd have had a cure by the year 2000 kind of thing. We'd be in the testing phases of a cure by the year 2000. Didn't happen, but other things have come along that have improved life to the point now that in 2020, that horrible year for so many, we got access to a drug that quote unquote reverses the effects of CF because it temporarily helps fix the problem that we have with salt that causes the thick mucus. So it doesn't quite literally solve the problem, but it makes it a lot more bearable as long as we take this tablet roughly every 12 hours for the rest of our life. And the version that came out in 2020 covers somewhere around 90% of the CF population. Now, for various reasons, not everyone can take it, but somewhere between 75 and 80% of the CF population are eligible and able to take this tablet. And it's revolutionized things. I mean, life expectancy in 2018, 2019-ish in the UK was widely seen as around 32.
Right.
So if you just do some quick maths in 2020,
You're doing
I
all
was
right.
dead. I was dead 5 years ago statistically.
Yeah. Congratulations.
Well, I've grown through so many of them; it's boring now. I mean, I
nobody
joke,
wants to be a statistic anyway.
No, well, exactly. I mean, I joke. I'm 42 in June, and I joke I'm entering my 22nd life because 42 over 2 is it's 22. So I'm going into that 22nd life. And, the people who are being born now, they're getting a life expectancy of between 50 and 60. Well, what's it going to be come their 50th, their 60th? It's going to be normal.
Yeah.
It's going to be 80, 90. It's going to be whatever it is for humans at that point.
I mean, this is amazing from a biological, physiological point of view, and I'm so pleased with I love science, as you know, and the breakthroughs it has for these kind of conditions. But there's a different element, and this goes back to sort of why you do the emotional worth thing, which is
exactly.
So you can take the tablets, you can solve the biology. But that mental burden, being told that actually you're not going to live past your 32nd birthday or your 2nd birthday or 9th birthday, and that in itself must be completely, if when you think about it too much, really demoralizing. And then I'm expecting, and I'm assuming you're probably going to have every milestone you pass, the doctors kind of suck their teeth and go, well, this isn't normal, or don't,
It,
that mental pressure of not being a statistic is almost worse, perhaps.
it can be. It depends on your doctor and your medical team.
Mm-hmm.
So the team I visit, there is one doctor who is very much, you're beating the odds. Don't get me wrong, they're well done. You're beating the odds,
Yeah.
but you're beating the odds. There's another one that just kind of doesn't mention that whole thing. They just talk about how you are in the moment and not have a better bedside manner, but have a more empathetic bedside manner.
Sure.
They're not just about the science and not just about the statistics. And then there's the ones that are in between the two. For the people that need that data, quite a lot of the AUDHD people will need that data. Perfect for them. And they up that for them, and they lower it for the people that don't have either the physical intelligence or the emotional intelligence to know where we need this and where we don't. And that's before you even get into things like what I define as unintentional gaslighting, because we don't necessarily know what's going to be going on. We don't necessarily know what's going to happen, but we have to play a worst case scenario so people are prepped and ready. And so there's this whole unintentional gaslighting thing, because actually we are invalidating a lot of what people are saying. Oh, I want to go and run up Mount Everest. Well, you can't. You're not going to be able to do that, because you can't run up there with cystic fibrosis. You've got too low lung function. You're going to need so much oxygen. It's not actually going to be possible to let it all up there. You're effectively gaslighting people's intents and challenges that they want to do on an off chance. And then there's the more serious side of it. I mean, because obviously, running up Everest would be a challenge for anybody. But I do know someone who genuinely wanted to attempt that. And I know of people who have got to the top of Everest with CF, both with and without oxygen, but they were the exception. They weren't the norm. And then you've got the people that, are just wanting to get a job or settle down, have kids, the more normal life expectancy things. And then there's the gaslighting around that, because, well, we don't know if your health will support that. So you can't really look at doing this. But then they accidentally get pregnant because they don't realize that, it's not that they can't get pregnant. It's that they shouldn't get pregnant. Or in the case of guys, we're technically infertile, and you end up in the position of, well, we're infertile. Oh, we're not.
We're not. Right. Yeah.
Because we're not actually tested to see if we are. We're just given usual advice, and what happens. Well, how many people accept that kind of advice at 20?
And also, it sounds like the kind of thing that's come about because people haven't lived long enough to have children in the past.
Yes.
So the assumption
some of it
is
is that. Some of it is that as well. But also then you've got the ethics side of it as well. Because it's a genetic condition, we can only pass on the CF gene. We've got 2 copies of the CF gene. Right. So your child will automatically be a carrier of the cystic fibrosis gene. If 2 carriers meet, there is technically a 1 in 4 chance of CF. CF gene from the mother or not. CF gene from the father or not.
Yeah.
If there's a CF person in that and you meet a carrier, that's a 1 in 2. Those are not great odds.
And again, maybe as a parent, you wouldn't want your children to go through what you've gone through.
But also, people with CF shouldn't meet. How do you handle that when it's your own kid?
Yeah. Oh, so why shouldn't they meet?
So we are very prone to chest infections. I don't know what bugs you have. You may not know what bugs you have.
Yeah.
Because it takes 12 weeks to grow, and it's not shown up in any samples or anything that you've sent off to the lab yet. That bug could be really, really deadly. That bug could be not a problem to you, sort of, patient 0 kind of thing.
Yeah.
But for me,
pass it on.
Because of my specific genetics or a particular difficulty I would have with insert Latin name here, we don't know. So we're advised not to meet. I mean, we wear masks at hospitals, 6 feet apart. COVID rules were normal for us from the late 90s.
Wow.
It just wasn't a thing. Not all hospitals enforced the masks. The ones I was at didn't until about 2018. Then they brought in the requirement for us to wear masks, as more and more were. But in the US, they've been wearing them since 2000. I'm one of the last generation that remembers properly socializing with people with CF in this country. Anyone born after about 95 will never have done it, or not knowingly done it. Because obviously I could pass someone, sit next to someone on the bus, and they could have it. Yeah. It's not, there are telltale signs that I would recognize, like how someone coughs, how they move, etc., would indicate they could have cystic fibrosis, and therefore I would take precautions. Not everyone will. Not everyone can notice it. So, oops, I don't know what that was. So, yeah, it was very much we shouldn't meet. And therefore, from about the mid-90s, we can't. So actually, also, you've then got, well, what happens where you've got two siblings? What happens where you've got a mother and a child, or a father and a child? Now, there are ways around it. I don't actually know what they are. Not going to lie. It's probably fingers crossed and hope. But it's you've got those kinds of scenarios as well. And how do you deal with the PTSD that can give you? So no, it's very much going back to the whole idea about emotional worth. We just don't have a lot of it.
Yeah.
I mean, people with chronic illness often have quite dark sense of humor anyway, but people with things like CF, we really, really do. You do not want to go in some of the Facebook groups that we run where there's CF dark humor going on. I mean, COVID was just hilarious for us because it was like memes of pictures of bugs going, damn, you live in this, I'm off. Which, I'm not minimizing and making fun of what happened during 2020, far from it, but it was very much, we're used to that. We're used to waking up every day not knowing if we're ever going to. We're used to waking up feeling like we can't breathe. This is normal. Welcome to our world. I mean, there were people walking around before sort of lockdown and before we kind of locked down. We kind of locked down sort of late January, early February. We'd been in lockdown 6 weeks before everybody else in the UK, but there were people walking around with t-shirts on saying, I've got a cough and I know how to use it, and things like that. Again, just highlighting the dark humor, but it's actually how a lot of us process that trauma.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a healthy way to express and process that trauma.
I did make a joke about licking a handrail in London just to try and catch COVID early on. I didn't do that. And actually, it turns out that when I did get COVID, it wasn't the best reaction. So probably a good thing that I didn't do that. But I think you do have to make light of these situations because you can live in misery, but we shouldn't live in misery. Like
Exactly.
Stuff happens, there's things we can't control. So it's how do we change that narrative for ourselves?
Exactly. How do we build that self-worth, that emotional worth, to realize that we are worth something? Every human on this planet is worth something to somebody, especially yourself. Because at the end of the day, the only person you will have a lifelong relationship with is yourself. Because even twins don't necessarily have the ability to be with someone 24/7 for the entirety of their lives.
No, absolutely. So how do you go about doing this then? What is your approach to challenge this issue?
So my big approach is my labels framework, where we teach people to learn what it is that isn't serving them, and to a certain extent, what is. Then we get them to accept that they need to change, or accept that they can't change this at the moment. Because sometimes a particular thing is happening and you need it at that moment in time. You need that diagnosis to get access to a treatment, or you need to just process this a little bit longer. If, for example, if that label that isn't serving you is grief and it's only been 3 weeks, you probably need it a little bit longer to really process it. So you've got to accept the need to change or not, because if you don't accept it, it ain't going to happen. After acceptance, you've got to believe you can change. Because again, if you don't believe it, really believe it deep down, it ain't going to happen. And then we experiment with what is going to work with you. Because if you're dropping a big label or a lack of self-worth, you don't necessarily know what's going to work for you and what isn't. So you've got to experiment and play around with it. And when you're doing that, you've got to live your life. So label.
Simple.
Very simple.
Go on, sorry.
So very simple, and labels are a big thing in the chronic illness world. I've got the label of this diagnosis, that diagnosis. It's not quite a competition to have as many as you can. It's not like Pokemon, got to catch them all. But there are people who want the label. There are people who don't. But all of us will identify to a certain point with labels of some description. I mean, everybody, regardless of any diagnosis, has some labels attached to them because we've all got a name. That's technically a label.
I am not a number. I am a name.
Well, there is that, but
it's still a label.
It is still a label, and it's one that serves you, because without your name, how would we identify that we are speaking to you when there's more than one person in front of me?
Yeah, absolutely.
In a situation like this, it's easy. You're the other person that I'm talking to. But if I was with you and some friends, how would we necessarily know it's you that I'm talking to? Because going, oi, you, is not necessarily going to work, because everyone will turn.
Absolutely. So I love that obviously you focus on chronically ill in particular because of what you've been through. You've talked about a lot of the mental load and the challenges of dealing with a chronic illness, does that manifest itself in this community in certain behavioral ways, or certain, do you see certain patterns when you're trying to deal with the community that you think actually it'll be useful to highlight so that people are aware that this is actually a coping mechanism, or this is a cry for help, or is there anything that springs to mind?
Product dark humor. I mean, unfortunately, one of the challenges here is coping mechanisms are often so endemic that people that aren't necessarily impacted in the same way will pick them up and use them to be accepted. And without realizing it, it will become a crutch. And so when they do actually start using it to discuss, so dark humor is a great example, because actually a lot of people will use it. They'll find things funny, but they'll say, another bug, just get added to the collection kind of thing. And some people may laugh, some not. However, at some point, you will hit that tipping point where they are starting to be funny to mask. And that's where it gets down to, this person, we need to identify this person as someone who potentially needs help. How they can get that help is so challenging within the NHS, because if you're lucky, you'll get 6 sessions of CBT, which may or may not be the right modality for you.
Yeah, and it's often online.
I didn't get on with CBT because CBT is a sniper rifle and I needed a machine gun, because there were so many trees in front of me, I couldn't see which one was the problem. And giving me a sniper rifle to aim at a specific tree would never work, because there were too many there. So I needed something like a machine gun or a scatter gun to just get rid of some of the trees temporarily. But I know for firing at every single one, I definitely hit the problem. And actually by removing some of the other problems or pushing them to the side, identifying them as this needs to be dealt with, but it doesn't need to be dealt with today, allow me to get to the problem. I used hypnotherapy for that. Other modalities are available. I now do a lot of work with NLP, timeline therapy, which is a way of representing feelings through time and why things have developed the way that they are. And, I'm in the process of starting hypnotherapy training as well, because of how useful it has been for people. And this is what I base the emotional worth coaching on, a combination of the two that I've got at the moment. And moving forward, we'll have the hypnotherapy angle as well.
I'm a clinical hypnotherapist,
yes.
so I'm totally on board with this. Sounds amazing. But also, similar to you, I do think having a range of modalities, because one size doesn't fit all. And like your example of CBT, in the right circumstances with the right buy-in, it can be very effective, but it's not the answer for everybody.
I'm not, please do, people listening to this, please do not think I am slating CBT. It did not work for me in that specific moment at that specific time. I would actually genuinely quite happily sit down with a CBT therapist now and work out if it was right for me with the problems that I face today.
Yeah. But
because I know what those problems are better. So I can turn around and say, right, this is the specific problem.
Yeah.
Not I don't really know. It could be this, it could be this, it could be this. I feel this, I feel that. Have a label of depression thrown on that, etc. That's not going to happen anymore because of where I've got myself, both through therapy and also through getting access to better treatments, being able to process these things, the things I've done in therapy before.
I mean, I think this is why what you do is so compelling, because it's that you've lived it, and you've also gone out and learned other modalities, recognizing limitations that you see. You've put the time in to do this.
And there's not that many people that work with the chronically ill and the disabled, because none of us have got any money. This stuff is not, unfortunately, this stuff is not cheap to get certified in. And by extension, it's not cheap for people to sign up to. The way I look at it, though, is as a hypnotherapist or as a master NLP practitioner, as a timeline therapist, as someone who's certified in other modalities, not me, but other people, things like there's IFS out there, integrated family systems or whatever. I might only need 10 sessions with that person to resolve their challenges in the moment, whereas CBT might take 20 sessions. So actually, if you're going to your CBT therapist that's, say, 50 quid a session for 20 sessions, or you're coming to me for 10, that's 100. It's the same amount of money. But actually, when you think about CBT, it might also be 30 sessions, 40 sessions, 50 sessions, years. I'm not saying it's still 10 sessions, but it's more likely to be a shorter process because I'm working at a very, very different level.
Yeah.
And therefore, it's cheaper in the long run. That's how I approach it with a lot of my clients.
And this is the great thing about all the modalities out there. And I'm such a proponent for sort of the neuroscience-based modalities like NLP, like clinical hypnotherapy for this very reason. And I know with my clients, I ask for a 3-month commitment, but the point is to be not needing me after 3 months. And
Mm.
for 90% of my clients, that is the case. Because like you said, you've got such a toolkit to choose from that actually you don't need to keep going back. And if you're going back to me again and again for the same thing, I've not done my job. If we deal with what you think the issue is and there's something new we find, that's a different matter.
Yes.
But putting the work in like you have to get the different modalities, to have that option from, and sometimes like you do coaching, sometimes coaching is what you need, sometimes therapy is what you need. The fact that you can offer both means that you can hopefully, well, you can and you do get to the cause, root problem a lot faster and a lot more effectively than someone who only has one modality.
And a lot of my clients come for one and end up having the other because they realize that they need both.
Absolutely.
I've not met many people in the way that I work where they only need therapy. Because actually, particularly with the chronically ill and particularly when it's genetic conditions like CF, we know no different.
Yeah.
You know, we've had this our whole life. And so to suddenly discover because you're taking a new tablet, you can breathe. Imagine both how amazing and scary that could be. And that is actually what got me across to doing this kind of work. I used to be a web developer. I talk about I've gone from developing websites to developing people because I was lucky enough to get, it's called compassionate grounds, but basically the drug company paid for my drug because the NHS wasn't funding it because of the cost, and it wasn't guaranteed to be effective enough to warrant the cost of it. And so certain criteria, if you met certain criteria, you basically, the drug company paid for me to be on this drug. And in exchange, they got some of my data, fine. For me, that was a worthwhile thing because
absolutely.
Back in 2017, when I got on that compassionate ground, I was in hospital for the torque transplant. And, you know, my lung function was not in a great place. It wasn't bad, but they start talking to you early where there's a history of mental health challenges. And in most cases with things like CF, there's a history of mental health challenges, you know, whether it's something as grave as having tried to take your own life, or whether it's just we've been on an antidepressant at some point. You know, that whole spectrum and more, that whole spectrum is there. And it doesn't matter whether you've hit every single tick box for, you know, has mental health challenges, has tried to commit suicide, etc., or whether it's once spoke to a doctor on a Thursday because they were feeling a little bit down because it was raining. You know, if you hit that mental health umbrella in any way, they will start the process a lot earlier, which I love because actually that catches the people that are on the edge of it that may not know what their problem is, but they know something's not right. And they're the ones that are actually almost harder to work with from a things like transplant perspective, because you don't know how they're going to react, what they're going to do. Whereas someone with a documented history of medical health, you've got an idea and you can work with it. You can go slower, you can go quicker, you can make sure there's chaperones in the room. Bob down the road, who was unhappy on a Thursday, you don't know what they're going to do. You don't know how they're going to react. Are they going to go inside themselves and not talk? Are they going to do something silly? We don't know. So the fact that it is so encompassing and goes a lot wider than it really needs to is a great thing, but it means it starts earlier. So, you know, my lung function at the time was around 40%. Typically, you'll be listed for transplant at about 20%.
Right.
But the lower your lung function, the quicker it falls, because you're going to struggle to get rid of the bugs. You're going to be on more intravenous antibiotics. You're going to be spending more time in hospital around more bugs. You're going to catch more. You're needing to eat more to keep weight on, because the lower your lung function, the more calories you burn just trying to stay alive. But you can't eat enough, so you lose weight, which allows more bugs to grow. So it accelerates. It's a bit like a snowball going down a hill, or Wile E. Coyote, you know, and painting a tunnel that Roadrunner can go through, but he can't. You know, it just gets worse and worse and worse the worse it gets. So that 40%, it might be a year and a half before you need to be assessed for the transplant. But actually, if you need a year's worth of coaching, therapy, ever, that's not that long.
No, not at all.
So it starts early. I was told that I met the criteria and they would fill in the paperwork and apply if I wanted to. Up and down on the decision, because I didn't want to transplant, but it was technically a new drug. I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know how effective it was going to be for me. Long story short, I took the approach of, well, actually, the worst that happens is in 6 months' time, I'm having this talk again. Best that happens, it's happening in 60 years, kind of thing. And I stabilized it. I didn't improve, but I stabilized. I went from having 8 sets of intravenous antibiotics and hospital stays a year to an average of 2.
Nice.
To this
And
day, since 2017, I have still not had more sets of intravenous antibiotics than I did in my last year before I went on these drugs.
amazing. And has your lung capacity function improved?
So not so much the capacity, the function has.
Yeah.
I've always been very lucky that I've had a pretty good capacity no matter what. Capacity and function are two slightly different things. One's about the size of the balloon that is your lung, and the other's about how well it works. My lungs have never worked particularly well, but they've not been damaged to the point that they've lost capacity. I'm quite lucky in that regard. But capacity doesn't mean you can breathe, and breathing is the important bit.
So I hear it helps us all.
Well, exactly. But the improvement there came in 2020 with the other drug rather than with the first one I went on. That, I say, just stabilized me. It was huge at the time, but now it kind of seems a bit, I've just stabilized, great. But at the time it was huge. And I'd snap. I know full well if I was offered it again now, having not had it, I'd still snap the arm off for stabilization over likely continual decrease.
Yeah.
But when I went on that, I had to basically learn to live. I was at the point of shutting down my contracting business because I was struggling to work. I was looking at going onto that scrap heap of medically pensioned off at 34. Now, don't get me wrong. When I started work at 20, I knew I'd be lucky if I was working by 40. But at 34, 35, I was not ready to go and stop. But I was looking at having to. It allowed me to continue and grow my contracting business a bit more. And beyond that, I started learning how to live. I discovered progressive property and progressive success, which is where I've done all of my training. I met the people who taught me emotional change therapy, human change therapy, NLP, etc. Did admittedly come a bit later. They came after 2020, but that was when I knew that I needed to help others learn the skills that I had done. Like I'd learned to value myself. I found by chance a specialist PT who also happens to have CF. We couldn't meet, but he lived in Northern Ireland, so it was okay. We only ever did anything on Zoom anyway. He specialized in helping people with things like CF because he had it. And, that was very, very helpful to a certain extent and not to another, because he was by CF standards, he was incredibly healthy. He was incredibly lucky. Did a lot of hard work to stay there, but and he's got a passing resemblance to Thor from Marvel, and does cosplay it. And he taught. Well, no, but also he does things like takes photos of him dressed as Thor, doing his nebulizers, taking his tablets, and puts it out on social media on Thursday, because it encourages other people with things to do just that. Because, Thor's got the same as me. Imagine how empowering that is to a little 2-3-year-old, particularly 5-10 years ago when Marvel was a lot bigger than it's become now, because people have almost got Marvel fatigue. 10 years ago, we hadn't got to that point. It hadn't been saturated. So the power of that was huge. But equally, it was very much a case of, here's me who, don't get me wrong, I've been lucky enough to be able to compete at martial arts at world championships. But I'm looking at somebody who looks like Thor. And I'm quite physically, I'm quite average. It's not a problem to be average, don't get me wrong, but I'm not Thor.
I mean, most of us aren't Thor. I'm going to put it out there.
No. But again, it's the whole.
But it gives you hope, doesn't it?
I didn't know. Not I shouldn't judge, but comparison is the thief of joy. I should have been in the moment of, I'm able to do this. I'm building myself up, and I wasn't, because I didn't know how to be.
Yeah, and that goes back to that emotional worth.
Exactly. That's where the emotional worth comes in. And eventually, by 2020, when I was back in hospital because I'd probably had COVID, we don't know, because I had to wait so long for a bed, and you only got tested when you went into hospital, that by the time I got in, I'd been waiting over 3 weeks, had it, and it had gone. They were so shocked that result came back negative that they tested me 3 times. And so officially I'd never had it until 2022, when the worst I had was cold-like symptoms. I was incredibly lucky in that regard. However, again, transplant talk. Yeah. This time there was no drug coming because it hadn't been approved. It hadn't been licensed. Drug gets licensed and approved by the NHS the next day while I'm in. So suddenly it's coming. And this is the big one. This is the one that hits 90% of people. I looked at it purely from a stabilization point. I looked at it purely from this is just going to allow me to continue. I might get some of the lung function back that I've lost because of COVID. I might not. But even if I stay at abysmal, that's fine because I'm staying at abysmal. I'm not going downhill. If I get back to good for CF, great. If I improve beyond good for CF and get to good for a normal person, absolutely, I'll have that all day long. But there are going to be people that don't know how to live, suddenly have to go and find a job because they're stable. They don't necessarily qualify for benefits anymore. They lose the car that they had access to through, well, what was then DLA, but had just become PIP, personal dependence payment, and so on. You know, they were going to lose all of this and they didn't necessarily know what to do, let alone normal things for people like yourself, such as this pension word. What's a pension? You know, my life expectancy is 35, 32, mate. I'm 37. I ain't ever going to need to have a pension. You know, my retirement plan was death. And that's something a lot of people with things like CF say, and we're all now rapidly trying to work out how we're going to survive in the future, because suddenly we're going to be living to 60, 65, 70. State pension's not necessarily going to cut it, and we haven't got a private one because we've not been investing because there's been no point.
I mean, that is a massive shift, as you say. Something, and I'm really glad we're having this conversation because, I mean, I certainly don't think about it. I mean, I as you know, have had an interesting life and almost died a bunch of times. But I still think I'm going to live to 100 regardless. I'm like, I'm going to keep going.
So am I. I mean, I semi-joke, I want to be the first person with CF to 100.
Why not?
Now, I don't actually care if I'm not first as long as I make it.
Yeah.
You know, and if someone else makes it first, great, good on them.
Yeah.
You know, I updated that recently because I heard 1,000,000 hours is 114 years and a couple of days. You know, that's the new goal.
Sounds like a nice round number.
And again,
to
if
work
I
towards.
don't make it, you know, if I don't make it first, good on them.
Yeah.
That's my aim. That's my goal. But I stopped working at 65. If I'm going to live to near enough 120, that's 55 to 60 years worth of private pension needed. Yeah, let me just go and put 6 numbers on a line on a ticket and stick it in a lottery machine.
See what happens. Yeah. No, it's a really interesting point. And I also love the fact that you talk about, you know, the impact of the benefit system. And in most countries that have a socialized healthcare or socialized state benefit system, you know, right now there's a lot of attacks going at it, both from the government side and from people who think people shouldn't get this. But the way you just described it, I think, is important for people to hear, which is, you know, if your lung doesn't function, of course you can't work, or of course it's difficult to work, or the exhaustion and the cycle of illness.
And the fact that the work from home situation has gone backwards, particularly here in the UK, you know, I mean, heck, Zoom of all things are now requiring their people to go back into the office.
That feels so wrong, doesn't it?
It feels ironic. But, you know, more and more are encouraging that. You know, certain things, it's always been necessary, and often the lower paid jobs as well, which is which are the ones that people with things like CF often end up with, because we're not reliable workers. We can't necessarily be there all day, every day. So actually to even have a salary as opposed to a wage. So the main difference for people outside the UK, for the UK, wage is often defined as hourly paid. Salary is often defined as yearly paid. It's 2 separate things. I mean, technically both can be worked out, but a waged role is often minimum wage, or, you know, maybe a little bit more if you're a supervisor or something like that. But a salaried role is technically something where you just get a figure for the year. We didn't necessarily hit salariable roles, which are often slightly more money and therefore able to have that better quality of life when it comes to being able to pay for and afford things.
Well, also better benefits, right? You might get a company pension, you might get other like company perks that you don't get in a wage role.
But they are also the ones that were more easily able to work from home in a lot of cases. You didn't get many minimum wage web developers, for instance. There are now because of how high minimum wage is, but we were often stacking shelves in supermarkets or whatever, where we couldn't work from home anyway. But the reversal of the work from home stuff is having a huge impact on people, that they can do something. But actually, if you're going to need them to get up 3 hours before they leave to get to work, to travel an hour and a half on the train into London, which they have to get into London by 8 o'clock to make sure they make the office at 9, you're back to people like me. I used to get up at 4 a.m. to make sure I'd got everything done. You'll be back to that.
It's a lot.
They'll get home 12-ish hours after they get in to do another 3 hours of treatment. So you get home at 8, maybe 9 o'clock. You're in bed between 11 and midnight, up again at 4. Now, 4 hours sleep is not enough for a normal person, let alone someone with something like cystic fibrosis.
I mean, you're already setting yourself up just to rejoin that cycle of illness.
So I help build the emotional worth that people can do what they need to do and value themselves the way that they need to do it.
It's so important. So what format does your work take? Is it coaching, workshops? How do you do it?
So there's coaching and workshops, and there's the therapeutic angle. The therapeutic angle is often session based, and typically people will buy a number of sessions with me and we will explore and work on what it is they need to. Typically, they'll come with a particular problem. I've got packages that last anything from 12 weeks to sort of a year, where we can help. I can literally help you rebuild yourself. I pick a theme for each year and give the product the name of that for the year. So this year it's Thrive in 25. Now I'm currently working out what it's going to be for next year. I'm thinking in the mix for 26. I'm getting a bit worried about 27 because I ain't using the word heaven. But anyway, but I've got my Thrive in 25 program where we basically take, everything I do and give it you over a year. And we kind of rebuild you over a year rather than rebuild you over 6 weeks or a couple of weeks. And that's group or small group based with some one-to-one time with me. I've got workshops where we start the process. So I talk a lot about helping you find your why. And from your why is where you can get labels and things removed and really work on who you are. To find your why, one of the things you need to do is do things like work out your human needs, your human values, etc. So I do values workshops. And almost everything I do is online. There are some things I reserve to being in person, but almost everything I do is online because people with chronic illness don't necessarily want to travel. Or it's someone with CF. That ain't going to work. So I do it all online. And everything I do can be done online. There are just some things that it's better to do in person because I might be doing a process with them where they're needing to move around a room with their eyes closed. I need to be in the room because I ain't going to make people wear things on their head that just puts a nice big stick going 4 ways out your head so you don't bash into anything.
I kind of want to see that now, but I take your points.
And that doesn't actually necessarily help because it might mean you don't hit the wall, but you might still catch your chair on the coffee or your leg on the coffee table or a chair or something. So there are certain things that I reserve to in person, but just about everything I can do. There is an online version for it. So I can work with you on Zoom. I've got workshops coming up on how to build your values. And there's different levels of that as well, depending on how new you are to all of this and how deep you want to go. And we just start building up the self-worth like that because once you know your values, you can work out if you're living your life in alignment with your values. So if your highest value is love and you are doing a job that you don't love and have never loved and really, really don't want to do, that's not living in alignment with love. Or if you value, money specifically isn't a value, but if you value money and, the security of having money is your highest goal, and you're working in a minimum wage job, you're probably not ever going to have money because you're talking about survival level wages. Now, I'm not saying I can help you go from minimum wage job to £1 million an hour, but I can help you work out what's going to work for you and build from that. How you take it and how you use it is entirely your choice. Everything I do with you, you are going to be making the choice of where to go next, what to do with it. I'm acting as the guide. I'm not acting as the teacher. This isn't mentoring. This is coaching. This is therapy. I'm not telling you.
And how can people find you if they want to work with you or learn more?
Best way is through my website or Instagram. So the website is dwt.coach, DWT being defining worth together, because that's what we're doing. And DWT_coaching is my Instagram.
Brilliant. I'll put it in the show notes. Dave, I've learned so much about cystic fibrosis, which I really appreciate genuinely, because I think, as I said, we hear these things in society and we don't really understand the impact it has on those living with them. So thank you for sharing. And I look forward to seeing your coaching and therapy progress as the years come, and also seeing you live to 114 because you and I are 6 months apart in age. So
I'd
forgotten
that.
Yeah.
I knew we were close, but I'd forgotten it was only 6 months.
Yeah. Maybe 4 months actually. So it's on, David. We're gonna make it to 114.
Yeah, joint party.
There we go.
in whatever home.
Yeah, exactly. Brilliant. Dave, it's been so good. Thank you ever so much for your time.
No problem. Thank you so much. Bye for now.